we are live. It is 4:34. And we will make sure everyone is admitted and call the meeting to order with Aaron, Rick, Tony, Steve, and Emily in attendance. And Obi and Makeda are absent today. Okay. For the commissioners in the room and on the phone, Elisa updated the packet, and as an updated packet, I think updated one I also posted online.
So yeah, you know, I'm trying to figure that out. It doesn't seem like it's the most recent version online. I don't know why that would.
Well, if there's anything substantively different, then we'll just share our screen.
Yeah, we can. It's just the OAO filled out now.
So. Okay. All right. So we will begin with citizens to be heard. It looks like we have at least one person on the line, the person who's identified as W. And if you're here to make a comment about anything on the agenda or not on the agenda, since we don't have a public hearing today, now is your first opportunity. You're welcome to come off mute or put something into the chat if you want to make a comment. Okay, all right, well, we will go ahead and move on to, again, ex parte communications and disclosures. We have nothing, no public hearings on the agenda, but does anyone have any ex parte communications to share? Okay, we will move on to approval of the meeting minutes from June 13th, 2022. And I'll start just by saying I appreciated the time stamping. It was helpful to be able to go back and reference. So thank you very much. Any comments, edits, changes to recommend? Otherwise, I'll entertain a motion.
I will move to approve the minutes from the last planning commission meeting.
Okay.
I'll second that.
Okay. Well, Steve, you're the second. Very enthusiastic seconding tonight. So motion by Tony, second by Steve to approve the June 13 meeting minutes. Any discussion? Okay,
I also want to echo appreciating the timestamp on there. Thank you for doing that, Jenna.
Any additional comments? Okay, all in favor of approving the meeting minutes from June 13th, raise your hand, or Steve say aye or nay.
Aye.
Okay, that is unanimous for those of us here. County Commission update.
Okay, so I will try to be brief. I did not bring my glasses. So the last meeting we had at 2, we started a workshop at 2 p.m. to talk about noise strategies. There's quite a few people around, maybe 15.
Yeah.
Ish.
A lot of public comments.
A lot of public comments. So a lot of they're kind of for and against, or I shouldn't say that, multiple strategies being offered by UTV businesses and people that are struggling with UTV. So it was interesting. I think there was some really great representation on both sides. And you know, we came about it after Citizens to be Heard, which lasted about an hour-ish, about half the time. Then August talked from economic development, specifically about kind of their strategies as far as tourism and promoting tourism and where they're going with their different campaigns. And then Daryl Meekum talked from the sheriff's office and talked about what they're trying to do. And then Josh Green, and HB 180. And I thought that was really interesting. So House Bill 180 talks specifically about, and this is actually what I equated it to. And he was like, that's exactly what they got it off of. You are required to take a course about UTV use. And I can't remember the specifics. It was 18 or older. Was it just renting or licensing in general? I cannot remember the specifics.
Exactly.
But anyways, it's like the shed hunting course, right? Where you do a little paragraph of information and you have to answer questions. You have to get 100%.
Yeah.
So it's something I will tell you, and Rick, I hopefully you'll agree. I think with the Division of Wildlife, they make you do that now for a couple things. And I think it actually does, educate the public as to why, why you can't shed hunt. You can't just drive across the sagebrush and look for sheds, So anyways, I think that's really great. And so Josh really went over HB 180. Just for planning, really quick, there was quite a few things on the agenda. The boat grant did pass, so we're going to move forward with the grant on that, which I thought was great. The adopting resolution for approving the final plat for Desert Soul, the HDHO, that passed unanimously. The Tin Roof Cabin Resort, that did pass, and that passed 4-2. I did not vote. And so Evan and Sarah voted against it. And basically kind of on the pretense that he is a local, and we don't think that we'll see, Kevin's point and Mary's point was the state legislature has made it clear, like, you guys can't just put a moratorium on everything, right? So the fact that we're passing a few of these that are out of town and are really small, we're hoping will appease that.
Was that Chick Taylor's?
Yeah, it's Jick's. Yep. So that did pass. I did not vote because Jick and I are really close, good friends, and so I didn't think that was appropriate. The rezone of the little commercial parcel in Thompson Springs passed unanimously, and we did deny King Creek's preservation and development request for sanitary sewer service, because as you know, we do not provide sanitary sewer service. So that was just a formality. I think that's it for me.
Yeah.
Any questions for Trish?
I like having you here. I like you. Where's Sophia? Usually Sophia's here. She's got my back.
Right.
I know. Where's she at tonight?
Small update, we have a new director of planning and zoning.
Oh, yes. Right.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well deserved, and I know that the department's in very good hands.
So thank you. Well, I'm honored to have this role, and I just want to do my best and
Yeah.
carry on John's traditions. And-
Really, because you're here.
Yeah.
I mean, I think
Can-
that I kind of made her go back in history and kind of give me her whole, like, where did you come from? What's your deal? And the reality, you're from Utah. She's from a similar, I guess I would say, environment. And so I think that goes a long way, really understanding, and then has been in Park City and seen what's happened in Summit County. And so
Yeah.
I
all
think
over
it's huge.
Utah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Sorry to butt in here. Since I don't have eyes on in the meeting, who are we talking about?
Oh, I'm so sorry, Steve. Elisa has been appointed the director of planning and zoning officially since.
Oh, that's great. Congratulations.
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you, Steve. That's a good reminder that you're called in. I'll make sure to be more aware actually throughout the meeting. Okay, any other questions for Trish, or congratulations for Elisa? Okay. Unanimous. So we'll move on to Economic Development Board. I'll give a little bit of context here. So up until this spring, I was serving as the Planning Commission representative to the Economic Diversification Advisory Board. There were two boards in existence, which was confusing. One was focused on economic development that included members from the chamber and from the planning or the travel council. The second group was looking specifically at economic diversification and for advising on broad priorities, but specifically we played an active role in advising on the grant specifications for economic diversification that just was announced a few weeks ago. The two groups were consolidated and the size of the group was reduced to allow it to be more agile and responsive, but with a common goal, common shared goal of promoting economic development and economic diversity within that economic development mandate specifically. So originally they were going to have multiple members of the public. They still are, but what they did is they've decided to bring back the Planning Commission appointee to that group. So I normally don't advocate for myself. I will say I do have a background in economic development, specifically working on issues like this, and I enjoy being on the board, but I also recognize others may want the opportunity to participate as well. So I'm going to leave it open to see if anybody has a nomination, and we will appoint somebody to represent us through the calendar year specifically representing the Planning Commission Board and bringing updates back to this new group. So leave it at that.
I'll nominate you, Emily, to represent us.
Thanks, Steve. Is there a second? Seconded by Rick. I'll ask for the sake of it, are there any alternate recommendations anybody wanted to make? Okay, well, I appreciate that. So with that, with a motion by Steve, a second by Rick, there is a motion to appoint Emily Campbell as the Planning Commission representative to the Grand County Economic Diversification Board through December of 2022. All in favor, raise your hand, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, so that's
Aye.
unanimous. Thank you, Steve. So one of the things that I know we'll be focused on is bringing more updates back, because it's less sort of specific to a singular goal and more about ensuring that economic development continues to reflect the various advisory groups and different bodies in the county. So wonderful. Okay. So under our staff reports, we have an update on the temporary dwelling permit, the OAO, current and future build out map progress. This is the update that's in the packet if you want to check your email, and maybe we can share the screen when we get to that point. And then looking at deed restrictions for local housing rules and regs. Steve, you're very welcome to participate in that. This is not specific to any individual HDO project. It's specific to
Going forward.
a definition going forward. I will turn it over to Elisa in a moment. I just want to take a second to recap where we've gotten so far with regards to the various land use code updates that we've been juggling. So in front of us, we have the question of ADUs. How do we get in line with updated state code? And then we have this question of temporary dwelling permits, which encompass a few different uses, including film and television productions or productions in general, and then the question of emergency housing for a temporary and specific period of time. So the Land Use Code Steering Committee met this week, and the reason I wanted to take a moment to provide some context is we are aligned around the outcomes that we recognize as necessary and critical in the county. Those outcomes include providing solutions for people who are displaced from their housing, solutions for people who find themselves unable to purchase or access sort of traditional housing, people who need temporary housing, which could be people who are maybe taking care of a sick relative temporarily and there's a room in the house. It could also include people who are working in the county for a period of time where it doesn't make sense, or in a situation where it doesn't make sense to have long-term traditional housing. And when we met with this group, there was concern. So in attendance was Bill Holst from the building department and Orion from the health department. Christina was there, Josie was there representing the council, or the commission, excuse me. And the discussion was aligned around outcomes and need, but recognized that a lot of these already have some version of a solution that isn't codified or isn't obvious. And we'll come back to some examples of that in the future. There also was some concern about separating the need to find housing solutions for people who are in a bad or temporary situation and still maintaining our necessary code standards related to things like wastewater management and flood channel risk. And so we are continuing to move forward, I think, and I'll turn it over to you in a moment to talk about the solutions that we are exploring and how we think we can get even more effective at approaching this issue. I just wanted to take a moment to raise the fact that anything that we are doing still needs to consider the real health needs of the county, including wastewater and the effects of any individual development, temporary or not, impacting the public health and putting others at risk. And that's something that Orion was bringing up. So I'll let you give a little more color to why I'm raising all of this, but I think that'll help.
No,
So,
thank you
Elisa.
very much for setting that up, Emily. Yeah, so at the Land Use Steering Committee, we focused only on the temporary dwelling permit section. We pulled that out of the section 3.3.3 temporary use code update that has all those other uses that we're looking at. But we really wanted to focus on temporary dwelling permit to maybe fast track it so we could get it to a public hearing. We did share that with Christina and she had some comments, and then we had this discussion at the land use steering committee, which involved her there, as well as Emily said, all the other folks that were in attendance. And what started to become apparent was that on the side of building, like with Bill being the building official and Orion being the sanitarian, they were kind of noticing some potential issues with allowing employee housing in kind of a camping situation where if we were going to allow RVs or camp trailers or camper vans to not hook up to utilities and somehow follow the rules of the health department by, setting some kind of schedule up for dumping and taking care of their waste, they just saw that as kind of opening a can of worms in terms of monitoring and keeping track of all of that, and that there has been a track record of those kinds of incidences where folks are illegally camping, but they're doing so without complaints happening. So we're not actually dealing with that on a code compliance level yet for most of these, but there have been violations with illegal dumping of waste and those kinds of things. So that was one of the biggest concerns with starting to allow camping in residential zones for seasonal employees and opening this up to kind of that whole side of things. So one of the suggestions that they had was specifically for the seasonal employees section of the TDP was to nix that all together and just see if we could potentially allow the voluntary compliance agreements that we may have in place. Like, for example, we have one right now that's active, to see if Josh is okay with it actually extending those out for a period of time. And in the meantime, we would go ahead and work towards getting the long-term camp park code update in place. And so that would actually entail requiring a higher standard of development where we wouldn't be allowing porta potties or water storage on site. We would be requiring those property owners, if they were going to develop a long-term camp park, to actually pay for the impact fee to hook up to groundwater and sewer and all of that. And so that's the preferred path for building and health department. So it's not the end-all decision, but that's kind of their input so far.
So I'll add a few more details. First of all, Dana was also at the
Oh,
meeting
Dana, yeah.
from GWSSA.
Yeah.
So for anybody who's listening in or anybody who's curious, a couple of things this does mean or things that need to be discussed. So for the current people in that one location that have been working with the county, this doesn't change their circumstances in the short term. That compliance agreement has been extended through, I believe, October.
Yeah.
So it really doesn't affect them directly because we were already going to be moving forward with looking at a longer term solution anyway. So if you're a member of one of those groups and you're worried about what this means for you, this does not create a fundamental change in your situation based off of what existed beforehand.
Yeah.
The second thing is, as Bill noted, we already have the concept of temporary permits. The distinction is that the temporary permits are associated with an accepted building permit or intent to build that the county accepts and acknowledges and then works with the landowner. So for example, if you were a person who wanted to build say the county allowed for employee campgrounds and you wanted to build one, today you could, once you have that approved, you could go into the building department and they'll work with you to get a permit to allow for certain usages. We do this for people building homes who put RVs on their lots. Right. So as Bill pointed out, we already have a means of handling this. Why can't we just strengthen that and codify it versus coming up with an alternate solution.
Exactly. And,
Yeah.
and so we do allow up to a year of living in an RV or a temporary situation while you are building your home or other development that would accommodate residency. The other thing that we already allow in our code is employee housing up to 5 units on the actual commercial property where the business is located. So it's
Right.
on-site employee housing. And we've had only a handful of folks actually take advantage of that. And we definitely want to encourage that more and get the word out to businesses that they can already designate 5 sites for RVs or cabins or those kinds of temporary living situations on there. And it doesn't have to be temporary, but they do have to go through the building department and us as planning and zoning for a site plan. So,
And the real concern, and I think this is a good concern, and it was shared by pretty much all the participants. I won't say all because I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was the consensus, is that what's happening today is employers are creating situations that don't align to county law or county standards, putting other county residents at potential risk, and basically shifting the burden of this need off of them, which it is not their sole responsibility to provide housing for their employees, but it shifts 100% of the burden onto the county to solve for the issue. And it is not, the county wants to work with employers, and not just employers, but the county wants to work with people who want to provide housing solutions, whether those housing solutions are traditional or maybe more of a temporary status, so long as they adhere to the standards of health code and building code, which are not set in Grand County, they're set by the state or at the national level.
Mhm.
And so I think that it's just important to note that the county continues to work with anybody who finds themselves in this situation and prioritize the needs and the dignity of the people in these housing situations. But what this does is it gives the county and employers or landowners and developers more creative ways to solve the issue, but does, put us in the position that we're also protecting the public health. So it's a balance, and I know there were some strong opinions either way, including my own, but I think that was the consensus.
Right.
So,
yeah, very true.
what's next steps there?
So the other sort of temporary dwelling permit categories that we have listed here are the temporary accessory dwelling for medical purposes.
which
so-
Orion said they do. through the public.
Well, so that is true, but what my concern is that we do have this statement here in our code that prohibits camping on private property. So I haven't gotten a word back from the attorney, but I do have a question out to her to understand if the allowance that the state provides for temporary living situation for medical emergencies or disasters, or even for as being a caretaker, if those would automatically be exempted from this blanket statement in our land use table section that says camping outside of a permitted recreational vehicle park, campground, or travel trailer park is prohibited in all zones. I just want to make sure that there is no reason to be concerned that if we don't have something in our code that exempts these kinds of situations, that we would still be allowed to permit those kinds of uses just through the state regulations that are already set up that allow these kinds of things. So
Melissa, can I weigh in on that? Because I noticed
yes.
it. I noticed that right away when I looked through the meeting minutes, because that specific piece of the land use code is something a lot of land management agencies point to when they need to enforce traffic type regulations on places like boat ramps, for example, at town ramp.
Mhm.
That's the code we point to when we say that camping isn't allowed at the boat ramp. And so I do want there to be a quick and effective solution for people who need alternative housing. I also know that that piece of code comes in handy for our land.
we don't want to get rid of that. And I understand that that's very important.
So I was wondering, is there a way we could reword that to say something like camping on unincorporated lands in Grant County is prohibited where posted? Because we would be posting any area like that anyway. In order to make it enforceable, judge is going to want to see that we had signs up in the first place. So it's something we've already going to be doing in areas where we don't want camping or living out of your car, however you want to describe it. Is like just rewording how that piece of code reads sufficient? Am I missing something?
Except where.
Yeah, so so I do feel like that might be the solution, is just simply to add an exception to what's already in the code, just to say we keep it just as it is, but then afterwards say, except in the following circumstances, maybe according to, the list that we provide with the these different exceptions, these 4 exceptions, or I guess it would really be 3 exceptions for the disaster, or when you're building your home or your camp park and waiting for that to finish, or for the medical purposes as a caretaker.
I think we should, again, based off of the conversation at the steering committee, the issue was not with adding employee housing as a category. The issue was twofold. One, we already have a solution for temporary dwelling, which covers the building your home case.
Right.
So 1 and 3 are accounted for.
Mm-hmm.
But also there was concern raised about the way it was presented as it's a housing emergency. And if the point was this, by doing this through a permit, this is the other thing, by doing this through a permit, it would be administrative, which means anybody who could reasonably say there's a housing emergency and I need to be able to camp and put my employees could apply for the permit, and it would be very difficult for the county to deny it. Whereas if we do it through a combination of building permits, where the building itself must be approved, such as the intent to build a employee camp park, and looking at the possibility of adding employee camp parks as a specific use or overlay in our code, it would make the overlay legislative and the building permit at least tied to something that was more permanent. So the concern was, how do we keep people from camping anywhere in the county and saying, well, there's an employment crisis, so here I am. And I think that was a really interesting nuance. So I think that covers 1 and 3.
Mm-hmm.
So it's then the medical man camp, which.
Well, those are different. So there's the disaster.
Oh, that's right.
That's what Orion was calling is the man camp by the state statute.
Mm-hmm.
But the caretaker accommodations would be, I don't know if that's something that, in my mind, that might be the one thing that we do want to be explicitly permitting as a temporary dwelling or a temporary accessory dwelling, because I've heard from now several folks that feels important and necessary, and I think it could be a good thing to have in our area. So
we'd have to be very cautious about how we defined the need and the requirements and the regulation.
Yeah. And I've seen some good examples from other jurisdictions where they have this exact permit, and they're in their application, they have some kind of qualifying language, and I can't remember what it was, but it might even have been something from a doctor, physician authorizing the need for a caretaker. So I think we could get to that for sure.
This leaves open the question then of prioritization of, however we want to call it, workforce camp park.
Right.
And
the idea of bringing that back up to.
And make sure the commission was aligned to that. But if we did that, it seems we should move fast in that direction, because we don't want to lose momentum behind solving this very, very clear and obvious need for the community. It's just a different tactic to solve the same problem with the goal of achieving similar outcomes.
Right. And so my idea behind that would be to And I know this, it's another step, another meeting, but I think it's important to get the commission, members of the commission on board with the planning commission and building and Orion all in the same room as we did last week. And so I would hope that I could set up another land use steering committee meeting to go over the long-term camp park code update, which has already been drafted. It's in a draft form. I just need to kind of polish it up and bring it to that body, I think, and then get some feedback and fine tune it. And then we could bring it forward. But I don't want to bring it forward without the commission having some eyes on it first and making sure that we're all on the same page.
So, what was the health department's, like, it sounded like they had a problem with sewage. And then what, like, they're having a problem with like the dumpage. They're like, oh, these people don't dump the sewage, and then it just like is going on the ground.
There have been incidents where Orion has had to
I mean, so like not,
issue
you know,
violations or whatever.
can we do things like attack it at the margins? Be like, not everybody has like things with like sewer lines. Could you be like, you have to be tapped into an existing like sewer, because on these RVs, all you have to do is run a 4-inch hose out to a clean out.
Right.
And then you're not like,
And that
then
is
it's
what,
not like, oh yeah, every week you have to go
Right.
dump and they didn't do it. And then it spills over and it's like,
yeah,
well, we could at least, I mean, if that's the hang up, it's like, well, could we get 20% of people?
That wasn't the hang up in
Oh,
general. The
okay.
bigger hang up. So
Mhm.
what we're not trying to do is rotate the entire land use conversation based off of a single property.
Okay.
Mhm.
The property that has been the place where we have been specifically recognizing this issue with the guiding company is in the floodplain, and there are porta potties in the floodplain, and that is completely against county health standards. And the point was, how do we make sure that, again, the employees are not suffering the burden of this issue, right? That particular,
Mhm.
the code department is letting that stand through October while we solve this problem. That doesn't put those people in a different situation. But if they went to renew that permit, the health department and building department are saying, if a flood comes here and knocks those porta potties over, that goes into our potable water source. We cannot have that. So how do we ensure that where we are working with employers to provide temporary solutions, the employer is working or the landowner is working towards a solution that is actually viable given our code standards, which is not what's happening here. So that was more the issue and the pushback to find a solution that didn't put the employees in immediate concern, but also made sure that we were holding ourselves accountable to our health standards and, quite frankly, the health code standards of the state and of the national codes.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
Did I
And to me,
capture
and
that?
this is
Yeah.
gonna sound kind of brutal, but let's say it costs 20 grand to put in the infrastructure hookups for an RV.
Yeah.
Right. The reality is, if you're charging $500 a month, you're making that back in 4 months, and then you're moving forward, right?
Mhm.
I mean, that's kind of the brutal
Mhm.
reality, is that we probably should have it put in properly, right? Those hookups have value, right? Once you pay the impact fees, you have hookups for an RV, it's like, then you're good to go.
Right.
And so that's kind of the direction you
Right.
guys are moving,
Yeah.
right? Like a permanent.
Yeah, and that would happen even with the temporary dwelling permit. It was intended to be a temporary situation anyway. And the way I wrote it originally was to prohibit porta potties and water storage in residential areas with
Right.
Yeah.
except
See
with-
what I'm
with-
envisioning is somebody has a resident, and they're
Yeah.
like, yeah, somebody needs to camp out in my yard. They put their thing in my clean out. It's
Right,
already there.
yeah, I see.
No
what you're saying,
money.
yeah.
That would
being
be,
spent. It's
that would
like,
be the
okay.
requirement in general, and there
Right.
would be like certain circumstances that could be exceptions, but that was kind of, that was where it got.
Okay, yeah, sure.
And as we've talked about ADUs, on a personal note, I've expressed that I think it's unwise to take off the table writ large the possibility of enabling some sort of way for people to provide an employment situation, a housing situation, and that, this could be a way of moving us into exploring where that might make sense and what circumstances that might make sense. So, and Orion from the health department, I think it's fair to say, since that was saying, like, this is something we could be doing. I support this. I support the possibility of using RVs as ADUs, although that's not how they would be permitted.
Right.
So I think if anything, we now have the health department and the building department and GWSSA and Grand County and Josie representing the commission aligned that there are many solutions that we haven't even considered. But in this one, we have a more precise approach that,
Mhm.
again, doesn't change the immediate situation on the ground, but does make it so that as we move forward, we are moving forward in a way that satisfies
Right.
a longer term need also.
Yeah,
Because
right, yeah,
temporary
right.
permits for 2 years or 6 months at a time really don't solve the
Right,
need. It just kicks
yeah.
the can down the road.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Exactly. That was the biggest thing.
Yeah.
I think that was the biggest takeaway for me, is that the idea of issuing these TDPs for seasonal employee housing was kind of kicking the can down the
Yeah.
road, and maybe even opening up problems for, not coming into compliance,
Right.
down the road.
Yeah.
And so I think having and Josh was good with the idea of extending the voluntary
Yeah.
compliance agreements
Yeah.
out as long as we need, until we can get our code updated and
Right.
offer that permitting path
Yeah,
for a long-term
got it.
camp park.
Okay.
When is the next steering committee meeting?
We haven't scheduled it, but I was thinking I would send that out tomorrow for a request to
Great.
get everybody together. Maybe, I would hope maybe this week, but we'll see how
That's
how
great.
everybody's schedules line up.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I continue to ask that we move this as fast as possible, given the needs around legal review and billing review and so on. I think. Thank
Sounds
you.
good.
Any additional, Tony, Steve, any additional comments or questions from either of you?
No, I'm glad to hear that we're not, as Elisa put it, doing a more of a kick the can down the road kind of way. I was feeling a little bit the same way the last time we talked about it. I think the people deserve a little bit of certainty. However much certainty we're able to give them, I think it's the right thing to do.
Steve?
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think it's great that we have the proper parties involved looking towards solutions, and that we're continuing to keep this a high priority to get some of those solutions implemented as quickly as we can.
Thank you. Okay,
Okay,
we
so
ready to move on?
OAO.
OAO.
All right, so I was working on this map until the last minute today, so I apologize for the last minute update to the agenda packet, but I will share my screen for those who don't have that in front of them.
Just while you're sharing that, just to clarify one thing, as we continue to look at the possibility of employer camp parks, whatever you want to call them, it's separate, distinct from OAO. This would be
Right.
specifically looking at developments that are explicitly for members of our workforce under certain conditions and not
Right.
overnight accommodations.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. So what I found is, and this is still kind of, I don't know if this is completely accurate, but this is what I've come up with so far. So the parcels highlighted in blue are the OAs that have not been constructed yet. And there's only two of them that are in the county and the others are in the city. So if we look down at the spreadsheet here, so the Radisson Hotel and the King Creek Campground are the two developments that are in the pipeline, but they haven't been constructed yet. So those would come online. Actually, the Radisson, that's the Moab Country Inn. They're kind of bringing their application back in for site plans. So they're kind of moving along.
Is the Radisson by CFI where?
So it's the one,
Is it, what'd you say?
Knutson's place.
Canoes.
yeah,
That's
so
what I thought.
it's,
Yeah,
it's
okay. That was, yeah,
this one right here.
yeah,
Yeah, that's it.
yeah. Okay,
Yep.
right by Holy.
Yeah, and then this one over here, obviously, this is the King Creek
Yeah.
Campground,
Oh,
which,
yeah.
we haven't heard much from them on that project, so we don't really know what the status is of that. But they are vested, so they could bring it forward if they choose to. And then as far as the city, the only ones that are left that I could find are obviously Lions Back up here, which is under construction now. And the spreadsheet said it was only 50 units in the hotel, but when I was reading there, I need to verify with the city what that actually is, but I think it's 188 casitas. And then I think the last article I read in the paper was 150 units in the hotel. So that number might be a little off. And then the other one, of course, is the,
Where is that color, Don?
oh, so for Lions Back?
No, I see the Lions Back. I'm trying
Oh.
to orient myself to street names. I see.
So the other one is the Shaw, Henry Shaw. And that one's right next to like,
Is that the movie park? Where is that?
it's in the city, and I want to say it's next to like Julie Berco's maybe?
Oh, is that behind Village Market and stuff? No, that's.
No, I think it's a little up from that, a little.
I can't before Northeast. Well, it doesn't matter.
Huh.
I know, I'm trying to. And it's got a
Yeah,
narrow.
we can zoom in.
Yeah. Oh, there you go.
Is that off of Boulder Avenue?
That's not behind the big hotel, is it? No, that's further down.
Unless it's already built out and I'm not recognizing it.
I can't think of.
You know,
Okay, so it's, you can see where the Maverick is. This
Oh,
is just to
you
the
can,
right. It's, you
sorry, my
can't,
computer's frozen.
It's to the, it's on the other side of the
so
highway
it's,
from
it's
Maverick.
like up, it's
Right.
like where A&E Electric is.
Right.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, there's some big empty lots there.
That's not the one, because I know there's the
There's
B
stuff in
and
the
B with
back.
the restaurants in front, and I thought that was deeded to.
I
be
think what he's
overnight.
saying is it's south of that. There's some big open
South of
lots
that
right
old
there,
house
right
by-
across from the Maverick, between lots, and
Okay.
then that's what you're thinking, right?
Huh,
Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah,
Yeah, and so that one was,
yeah, that's probably true.
trying to think what I think it was like 200.
See where 40 comes out and just go
Mhm.
over. See where Jones is, yeah.
Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying, yep. Yep.
Oh,
So
I know
it's-
which lot
it's
you're
from the
talking about.
BLM
Yeah,
Mhm.
I know which one.
back south. and
Jackson Street goes up.
Yeah, I can
Mhm.
see Jackson, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so that is.
So most of our vested properties are between the
Mhm.
Lions Back and the Radisson, right?
Yeah, and this hotel that we were just discussing is apparently 222 units. So it's quite a lot.
The
Well, and then there's all the units
Oh,
on the
the one we were
Sitla.
just,
The Shaw
The Shaw,
or whatever.
uh-huh.
Okay.
Do we have any more information about the Sitla property by the university? Because that's another place they're talking about putting intentional.
is it Nightly Dentals?
I've heard,
Oh.
I lost track of whether it's this
Okay.
or that. but
Yeah,
know
I
that that
don't
was the
know, and
conversation.
I need to check in with the city on, because that is, I mean, we do, the way we calculate our OAO ratio is the whole valley, so,
Right.
except for San Juan County.
Right.
So,
Right.
So you
Um,
look at the numbers and you add up the unspecifieds in 3 different categories, and that's 77% of all the stuff on here.
Huh.
So what are all those things?
are you saying, the ones that are the existing?
Well, you got unspecified campgrounds,
Oh.
unspecified hotels, which is like 2,400.
Yeah, see, this
Units
list
and-
is a mystery to me. I inherited this list
Add all
from
those up,
Kevin.
you divide it by the total number and 77%.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
there's a whole
unspecified,
bunch of them out there.
there are, yeah, I think the unspecified campgrounds,
Right.
there are a lot of campgrounds that I don't have the
Most
exact
of them are
locations of all
hotels.
of them. And then the hotels, yeah. Yeah, so I would like to know more about those numbers and the history
And that all
of
might
where
be
they came from.
Cape Creek, who knows, but, or at least
Yeah.
a quarter of it,
Can
maybe, I don't
you-
know.
Approach Kevin about that?
Yeah, and
Okay.
I can. I think it also might be a question for, I want to say maybe Zachariah or
Uh-huh.
whoever was
Right.
working on this at that time.
Yep.
So, Yeah, so, but I think, so what I've kind of calculated, so with the updated numbers for the Lions Back is about 760 still to be constructed units. So I guess. Interesting.
Mhm. I mean, it's interesting because we had a number of business owners the other night at the meeting. One of the complaints was their occupancy rate being low,
Right, I remember
and
that.
they were putting that on us because we're not advertising enough. And
So what's the average nightly rate?
exactly, we didn't get into that. Yeah, exactly.
Double.
And the fact that, yeah, I mean, at a certain
Gas
point,
prices.
gas prices, yeah, to me, it was a little like, there's a lot of
Anecdotally, I'm
factors.
hearing about hotel rates that are more than double what they were 2 years
Sure.
ago.
Oh, yeah, no, I looked up that night, so it was funny, I looked up as soon as he said what place he owned, I looked it up, and they were sold out. I tried to rent a room and they were
Oh.
sold out,
Interesting.
and, right, and then, yeah, the rates are, I think they're lower than they usually would be right now, but everything's over 200.
How does well, you might not know this, but I'm curious to know how the occupancy compares to this time in 2019
Right.
versus, because the last 2 years. have
Yeah.
been Bonkers.
And
And
Chris,
plus, we've
yep.
had more units come online in the
Yep.
last 5 years and more units and the
Chris
same number of
was-
people.
I think Chris did a good job, at least that was my takeaway from his presentation, is that these last 2 years were an anomaly that we cannot
Mhm.
rely on,
Yeah,
right?
so true.
He gave us all kinds of charts and graphs and this upward trend that he's had since 2014.
Right,
But these last 2 years, we can't rely on those numbers.
exactly.
I mean, this is again anecdotal. I continue to hear from people who say, I used to love coming to Moab. It's too crowded. I don't go back.
Right.
And I think, it's interesting it's easy to look at one slice of the problem and say, oh, we need to advertise more. We have low, numbers. But I think any consideration of that needs to be placed against how has the character of the place changed? What do people expect? What different options are available? And then
Right.
outside of things like the cost of gas. And,
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, I do think lodging rates, you guys, I'm sure you all feel that. I went to Glenwood on Friday night, it was ridiculous.
Well, and
The-
airfare is up
right.
significantly as well.
Right.
And airfare is less
30% up, yeah.
reliable. People are less
Sure.
likely to fly. There's a lot of
Factors at play,
factors.
yeah.
Mhm,
So,
very true.
And there's still long lines to get into churches.
And still.
right.
With the
So
reservations
I
and stuff.
wonder if that has anything to do with it too. The park might have perspective on that.
Yeah.
Looking at comparables such as Estes Park when Rocky Mountain National Park went on
Mhm.
reservation, I'd be curious if they saw a reduction in
Mhm.
visitation
wow, yeah.
associated with the permit structure, 6 months after
Yeah.
implementation.
I know.
That would be
Might know,
interesting.
yeah.
Was the
Anyways, that-
request, in addition to advertisement, is there,
Yeah.
are we
we're-
hearing from the business community if they'd like to see more nightly rentals of types, or is it more
No.
to service the existing ones?
Yeah, that they feel, that they wanted their own occupancy to go up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So this is kind of, I'll keep you updated if anything, if I can, get some more accuracy on these numbers and.
That's,
Scroll
it's
down to
great
the
though to see that, right?
Just so people can see.
Yeah.
Kevin, compiled this?
He sent it to me, but I don't think he worked on it by, solely. I think it was a joint effort. Back in 2019.
So,
Okay, and.
Any other comments, or shall we move on to our next agenda item? Thank you for compiling this, or
Yeah,
for sharing
great.
this, and
Yeah.
the map is very illuminating, actually. So agreed that it's, for a long time, the concern from people in the community was that our neighborhoods were changing due to the number of Airbnbs and spot zoning, and really what we're looking at now is there will continue to be an impact and growth because of these vested properties, but it's really 2 different properties that are going to drive it, 2 to 3, depending
Right,
on what happens with Cane Creek.
Yeah.
Okay. And they're not located inside populated residential zones either.
Right. Mhm. That's good. It's hotel development versus Airbnbs. So. Okay, so we're ready to move on to HG or I wanted to put these in here for you guys to read just so far what we have with the HGHO program, how we've been defining a qualified household for the deed restriction program associated with the HGHO. We want to take this as the basis and then probably modify it going forward so that we can, not for HGHOs that are established, but so what we would be doing is looking at defining the qualifications for deed restricted houses for locals, not just actively employed households, I think is kind of what we were hoping to figure out for the future of deed restricted properties, because we might be able to have more of these come up into the future outside of the HGHO program by other means.
Right.
Through economic.
Workforce campground.
Yeah, right. And the Economic Development Department has a funding source now that they want to apply to incentivizing purchasing of deed restricted properties. So not purchasing the property, sorry, but incentivizing the transaction of when a home is bought, that the Economic Development Department would be able to provide the new owner an incentive to go ahead and put that property into a deed restricted status going forward. And it's based on the model that Vail is doing in the Housing Authority. So, so we do see the potential for future deed restricted properties, and we want to be able to kind of define what we think should be the qualifying criteria.
How would you like to go about this? Do you want a survey for ideas? Do you want feedback on the specific text?
I think initially I didn't have a lot of time to put together a staff report or anything on this. So I just wanted to put this, I wanted to share how we currently define actively employed households and deed restriction through the HGHO program. And then possibly we can get together on some ideas for the next meeting on how to go forward with defining it in a different way.
I have some thoughts, but I'm going to save them to the end just so I don't dominate the conversation. Let's start with our members who are on the phone or called in. So Tony or Steve, we'll just kind of go round robin. Do either of you have any suggestions that you would like to be considered or questions to ask?
For me, sorry, Steve, if you wanted to jump in right away, I kind of swiped that. That's really dense English I'm looking at, and I would love to do it as a homework assignment.
The other thing I thought about is because Laura at HASU is right now going through the process of really digging into these qualifications and defining them for herself, for her own process of qualifying buyers. And so she might want to come to our next meeting. I could invite her to kind of interpret some of this dense language. And then also she might have some thoughts. I know she would have some thoughts on, potential modifications for a future deed restriction program.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
sorry if I'm a little unclear, but so what you're saying is a deed restriction program so that we could offer it up to developers. Like these are one of the things that you had mentioned when these developers are coming to us and we don't really have anything in place. Okay.
Right. And
So,
if we are able to, at some point in the future, through our housing study that we're trying to get done, require deed restrictions going forward for new subdivisions.
Okay.
That's where this would come into
Okay,
play.
great. Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Steve, do you have any comments? before we move on to folks at the table here?
Yeah, can you hear me coming through?
For the most part, we'll let you know if there's an issue.
Okay, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, it's better.
Okay, sorry, dealing with Bluetooth and headphones and this, that, and the other. I guess I don't have too much to say here. I think it's great that we're continuing to look at this and refine these qualifications and whatnot. I think one thing just to share from firsthand experience with part of the HDHO as we, as we look to develop Murphy Flats with my wife and partners, just the issue that we've run into in trying to get local workforce housing people into these units is just there's a lot of fear of, well, gosh, what happens if, I take out this loan, I now have a mortgage, I have a house, I'm so excited, but then I do lose my job and I can't, find work back within Grant County within 3 months. That's like, it's like injury to other injury, losing your job and then your house as well. And so I think finding ways that, it's really just, it's the occupant of that house rather than maybe just, the owner. Because I think that's what we're trying to do is just get people that live here in the homes. Ownership is great. So yeah, just continuing to highlight that, because that's what we've really seen is people, signing up to, buy one of these units, and then ultimately they're like, "Ooh, that's just too much risk for me to take on," and then they back out, which is, it's really disheartening to see, because it's like, oh, we're so close to getting people in these units, but then it ultimately doesn't work out. So yeah, I think that's really all I want to share there, and I think it's important to reiterate, we just continue to refine and make this really workable and an awesome application for our residents.
Steve, what would be your recommendation on that piece as far as lapse in employment? Do you have a number that you think would be more palatable?
So that's a great question. I think that could work in some instances. At least for the HDHO, what I would recommend, and this is no secret, but would be that anyone can own a unit, but the occupant has to be workforce housing. So that way, if it is someone who's a local workforce, I keep botching that term there. Someone is a local worker, they buy a home, and then they lose their job, they could still own their home and not be forced to sell at whatever the market is doing. Let's say the market is really tanking, and they're forced to sell, then they lose everything on top of having lost their job. But if they could still remain the owner of that unit, then they could lease it out to another resident, and then they would still have to sort out, finding work. And if they worked out of county, they still own their home and they didn't lose, everything they put into that home. And so
just to
maybe doesn't mean.
What if they didn't lose their job? What if they quit their job and moved to Salt Lake? Do you see that as the same situation, or do you see that as different?
That's certainly a different situation, but at the end of the day, the person that has to live there is still a Grant County worker. It's still a resident, because it's the occupancy, and that could happen. And I think, if that were to happen, it's not the best situation. It's not like ultimately what we're going for. Because let's say, the house, what if the house just sat there? I think that's kind of, like a likely worst case. I think that kind of is what it is. And I know that there was a lot of talk about, well, what if some out-of-state person or entity buys one of these units and then they illegally stay in it and they never rent it out to anybody? And I personally think that's a pretty pessimistic look at things. And I don't think that that's likely that, many people are going to willingly commit a Class B misdemeanor. So that's my thought on it there.
I want to interject, not to you, Steve, but in general, two thoughts on this one. And this is for me personally. I am not personally against the idea outright of extending ownership, but I would not support it unless the state was willing to work with us on a rent cap requirement.
Right. Right.
Because if
I agree with you.
the state,
Exactly.
which it's currently not allowed in the state of Utah, but we see the state making
Right.
strides in terms of creating more housing opportunity.
Mhm.
And where we see housing stress in our
Right.
county, it's not mortgages, it's rents.
Right.
And what would stop somebody from buying one of these houses who doesn't live here or
Yep.
lives here and leaves, and then suddenly they're, charging $2,600 a
Yep.
month rent, and now that is no longer an affordable
Yeah,
unit.
I agree with you.
So I would say this could be a really great opportunity for us to approach our senators and talk to them about an exception to the state law that would allow us to extend ownership to people who aren't specifically in this under very specific circumstances. I also would not be comfortable with somebody owning more than one unit in that situation.
That's that's
So,
great. That's another, because that was my thought,
Yeah.
if somebody could just buy a bunch of them up and
Right.
rent them for
Yeah.
some astronomical
I-
amount. And you're renting to workforce, but I hear it all the time.
I would
People
not
all the
support
time,
that.
yeah.
I would openly
Okay.
say that I don't think that
Okay.
supports the intent here, which we've already seen this happen with other government programs. Self-build, it's
Yep.
great. The first person who owns the house
Yep.
gets this incredible deal, and then they sell it for
Yep.
$450,000. It's no longer an affordable home,
Yep.
and that's land we can't use for our residents. So
Yep.
I just wanted to, I do
Happen
think
a
that
lot.
that's an opportunity for us going
Yeah,
into
I
the next
like that.
legislative session. So, okay.
Yeah, I certainly hear those thoughts. Oh, am I muted?
No, we can hear you, Steve. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Perfect. No, I certainly hear those. They can hear me.
Hear you. Yes.
Sorry, just to confirm, you can hear me, yes?
Yes, Steve, we can hear you.
Okay. Sorry, we've got a lot of technology going on in the car right now. Yeah, I certainly hear those points. One thing I would just throw out there is, that once more units hit the market, now there's more stock available, and so higher supply. I think that would then also reduce some of the rates, wouldn't it? We're seeing such high rent prices right now. That's because there's nothing available right now. And so the supply is super low, but the demand is incredibly high. And so, bottom line is just create more units, and then things should, via competition, start to even out a little bit.
That's true to an extent. And that was certainly the intent of maintaining ownership, because you create a secondary market by having owners who are restricted to people who work here. And therefore, there is a natural constraint on the cost point that you can sell a unit for. Once you start allowing for rental units, not only is enforcement an issue, which is also a primary reason that there was concern about extending ownership, but the other thing that we have seen nationwide, and particularly in investment areas such as ours, is investors with bottomless sources of cash. Think a hedge fund on Wall Street coming in and buying up 12 units and renting them out for ridiculous sums of money. And the issue with this program that is a potential weakness if we were to extend it there is it's not legislative. It is all administrative. And so we can't say, well, you can buy, but you can't because you're a hedge fund and we don't like you, but you're just an outside investor who's getting your start in the market at 28 years old in Salt Lake. We wouldn't have that discretion. And we could very quickly find ourselves in a situation where our stock of units, and remember, we are putting density in our neighborhoods where people explicitly said, we prefer to have a more rural feel. We asked our neighbors in our community to find a compromise so that we can increase the stock of housing available to our workforce. And if we go back to our community and say, well, we're going to let a hedge fund from New York put this, up by, and I'm not trying to attack you, Steve. I think what you are saying makes sense at the case of an individual, 30 years old, buys a home, gets new opportunity, doesn't want to sell their house. It's a great chance for them to provide something back to the community. I totally see the point. I just see all the ways that it could be taken advantage of. And that's why I think we need to be extra cautious and deliberate about how we approach this. A rent cap would be one way of approaching it, but the state does not currently allow for that. So that's, I think, an interesting maybe legislative option if they were able to work with us on that. So always look for ways that people could take advantage of situations because someone inevitably will. That was me being cynical, but
No, I mean, the institutional investors are a real problem. And I don't know if there's any other way to prevent them from kind of taking over in a situation like we have, but I mean, I think the rent cap is probably the one solution that we could apply, but it takes some work.
it would take some work.
One thing I would just like to kind of underscore here, and then this will be the conclusion of my comments, is just to again share, what we are seeing, just as this HDHO specifically is very new, and we're still really just gathering data about how it's truly working. And one thing we have been running into that we have seen is people saying, "Oh no, I don't want to do that. It's too risky." So at the end of the day, if an ordinance is created and it's not fully utilized, then I think that beckons the need for revision to some degree. So that's all I want to highlight. It's just what we're seeing. So kind of anecdotal evidence there.
It's helpful to know that. Thank you, Steve. Drive
Sure
safe, please.
I'm passenger. I'm shotgun, so we're good.
So this is for stuff that's like the self-help houses. Is this kind of like the future of what we're trying to do with those?
Oh, okay, well, this is, so the HDHO program is a high density housing
Yeah.
overlay. It's not self-help. Royal Crossing is a self-help. That's
Oh, I
different.
didn't know because I'm seeing
Yeah.
housing authority. I'm like, is this where
The
they're
housing
trying to?
authority is only
steer it?
involved in the sense that they are the approving entity. They qualify buyers to purchase HDHO units.
Okay.
In a little context here, these are not, when the ordinance was adopted related to HDHO, the county believed that the ordinance was, could be interpreted as written and as the language of the law intends, but there was some miscommunication and misunderstanding. And so the county created these rules and regulations to clarify how the law was written and adopted so that there was no confusion, which is why we have these. But what we have understood in general is because this reflects our land use code, we don't currently have this definition explicit in the land use code. And so we want to make it explicit so that as we reference workforce housing and things such as potential additional deed restrictions, assured housing, employee campground, and so on, one, there's a common definition throughout, but also there's this question that Steve is alluding to, which is who falls through the cracks if the only way to enforce that is active employment within a 3-month period? And are there reasons to extend that to include people who fit the intent, but might not fit that exact definition, if that makes sense?
Right.
Is that,
Yeah. And I think there was the idea too of like, well, maybe we should be thinking about folks that are not actually working actively, but are locals, retired people.
That's fine. Like, oh, what,
Yeah,
you
like there's a
retire and lose your
whole
house? Like,
segment
is
of the
that-
community that we'd want to be able to provide local housing for that might not be actively employed. So,
let me share some of my notes since it covers that, and then we can continue and extend the conversation. So as I've been thinking through this issue, some of the things I hear, and actually there was somebody who noted this just yesterday in a Facebook comment, people who are primarily women, but any person who is a full-time homemaker who finds themselves divorced, finds themselves in a situation where they need to leave the home, would not fall under the category of actively employed. So I would like to see this extended to include people with school-aged children currently enrolled in our school system. That is one way to, pre through 12, or potentially even a local daycare that can verify active enrollment in a daycare for children. The people who often find themselves in those situations tend to be women who are in impoverished situations and do not have options available to them, and often find themselves continuing to live in abusive or neglectful situations because of that lack of options, which is a perpetuating issue. Second, somebody who is retired but has evidence of active employee in Grand County that would have met the requirements in the code and can demonstrate that they have not had a change in full-time residency from Grand County since they were actively employed. So that isn't people who work here for 50 years, go and retire somewhere else and then come back and buy their vacation home of their dreams. These would be people who work and retire in Grand County and either have already purchased one of these homes and wish to stay or rent, or somebody who is in that situation and needs a rental or employment option. A third, and this is a little bit harder to define, this would have some questions of enforcement, but a full-time homemaker or caretaker who can prove their status. This is an example of somebody who primarily takes care of a family member and might not receive income for that, but is a resident here and can demonstrate that caretaker status. Often, again, tends to be women, often again, tends to be people of lower on the economic pole, and often tends to be, not always in this case, but often minority groups represented. People who have been residents of Grand County for at least 3 years and were a student as of the last 5 years or 3 years or something to that end. So you graduate from high school and you want to rent a home or something. Maybe you have other forms of income, maybe, who knows, but maybe that's, again, this is kind of going from really specific to much less specific, but where is that line? And then kind of finally on that end is, would there be interest to consider a first level relative of somebody who meets any one of these standards or some strict or form of these standards? So an example might be, I have kids in the school district, I'm a full-time employee, and I need my mother to come to town to help and, me with my kids. Remember, the ways that we're looking at ADUs right now might also include this definition in the case where we want to deed restrict additional ADUs. So maybe I rent out an internal or ADU to a student, and I want my mom to be able to live in the ADU off my garage, or a tiny home I'm building for her. Should my mother qualify for that if she's living on my property or if I'm full-time employed? Again, enforcement would be a lot harder. So I think certainly, and then I guess the last is unemployed, but haven't had a change in residency. So unemployed, but with a previous qualification without any change in full-time residency. So Steve, this is your point of, I work for a local guiding company. I buy this house or I'm renting this house. Oh my gosh, I got laid off, but I'm still living in Grand County and I'm looking for my next job, or I'm a teacher, or we're not laying off our teachers, but you see the point. So long as I don't change residency and I'm actively looking for a job, or maybe I'm going back to school, should this also include adults who are full-time students? That's, again, in that fuzzier, but these are some of the ideas that I've had of people who I think represent our community, represent people who contribute to our economic base, represent people who support our children and other members of our economic base, and do not have adequate solutions available to them in the existing open market for all houses. So those are some thoughts.
It's a good list. It's a good start for sure.
Those are some great ideas and great, really just, great solutions and pinpointing exactly who is currently left out. So I really like that. Those are very specific. Great job.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks, Steve. Go ahead, Rick.
So what about on the other end? I don't know how the HACCP thing works, as far, but say you qualify to get in, then you start, your income goes up. So is there a place where they're going to say you've got to get out? And is the getting out point put them in a place where they can actually afford to go somewhere else in the county? Do those overlap, or is there a gap there? Is there any incentive to improve your lot in life once you get into these things?
Well, it's not,
This is not
limited by income at all.
It's
So
not.
Unlike the
Yeah.
Couldn't
USDA.
tell.
Yeah, I know, it's kind of, it's counterintuitive to a lot of programs that are
Reading
out
it, I
there,
got the
but,
impression that it was, so.
Right.
The entire intent was, right now, our housing prices are being driven up by people who are coming in with outside
Right.
means. And if we have a secondary market that is limited to folks who live and work here, there is a natural limit to the economic buying power of people who work on Grand County wages. And, that doesn't mean everybody who qualifies for this doesn't have some other means of income or born into wealth or has just done particularly well for themselves. And if that is you, great, congratulations. But because it injects supply with a limited demand, the idea is that it would help to create a natural upper boundary in the market that would find a median that actually met the needs of the community.
right. And I think the overall goal of HDHO, in addition to future programs that we might be able to implement, is to kind of increase the pool of local housing, deed restricted housing, or in perpetuity, to kind of keep increasing that pool of local housing that's only legally can be occupied by locals. So,
And all of this is enforced by the county. And so if somebody were to be in a position where they were renting a home in one of these neighborhoods today and lost their job, they could petition the county, just as we have people currently, as we discussed earlier, in a situation where they are living outside of the code as written in terms of the folks in the down by the the sluice, but
Right.
it's still, the county works with people. The goal is not to displace people because they are 91 days outside of a strict window, but it is intended to allow enforcement that keeps people from taking advantage. So I do think our county does a great job of putting people first.
yes, I agree. It's a tricky line to walk for enforcement and making sure that people have places to live.
Okay, any additional comments? And did you get what you needed from staff's perspective on this?
Yeah, I did, definitely. And I think we'll just keep this on the agenda for future meetings and kind of keep developing it, and maybe have Laura kind of chime in on anything that she's learned through her research.
Awesome. Do you have a chance to add? Do you want anything, or are you good?
Oh, I just was looking, okay, so like you're forced to sell if you're not in compliance. There's anything with like, in that selling, is that like, it says you can use a real estate agent and whatnot with it, okay. So that's like, there's no restriction on prices,
No.
once these things are made, it's, okay,
Yeah, it's only to do with the occupancy.
occupancy, okay,
Mhm.
okay. All right,
And the status of the owner.
Right,
Occupancy and status.
right, you're right. Ownership and occupancy for this one.
so the idea is like, okay, the Grand County employees, like these qualified people can probably only pay like, instead of having, I see where you're trying to like do the rent cap go around kind of thing. Like you're saying, creating a secondary market.
And I don't say
Within-
rent cap lightly, because the intent of this was never to cap. I
Right,
just
no,
think
no.
if we wanted to extend ownership, that would be a way to just
Yeah,
maintain.
secondary
outcome.
market's way better term, right? So it's like you having the side market for these things that can only be used in perpetuity.
Right,
That's what these things are gonna be branded.
for the HDHO specifically, but
Okay.
the discussion about going forward with deed restricted units could potentially mean changing the ownership, extending the ownership, as Emily was saying.
Okay, gotcha.
So that would be where a rent cap might come into play
Okay,
in order to mitigate the possibility of just out
Yeah,
of control.
I gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, no, seems thorough.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Great.
Okay, up to speed.
I did just send you guys just really quick. I found a house bill from a couple years ago where it looked like they tried to propose some rent control and it failed. But anyways, I just sent that along to you, and it's maybe we approach that sponsor again and
Yeah.
I am reassured by so when we were looking at the code as written for ADUs, there is an exception to the ADU code that allows municipalities to use rental sites like Airbnb to report and enforce non-compliance, which is something that is illegal in any other cases. So the state legislature already has demonstrated in this last legislative session, in order to inject more housing into the market, particularly into areas like ours,
Right.
that they are willing to relax their strict standards around
Right.
other means that they have taken off the table in order to protect the freedom and voice of the people who own the land is ostensibly the reason there. And I think the fact that we've seen some trade-offs, you know, the
Right.
strategy is get more
I
housing. Our
agree.
legislature is obviously invested in that.
Yeah.
So
Right.
I'm really excited to see the legislature open up their strategy, and I'm hoping this is an area
Yeah.
they might be willing to work as well. That's good. So, okay. Let's move on to, okay, future considerations. So we have future land use draft maps. Before we go there, I want to just put in one quick future consideration we're not going to spend a lot of time on. I wanted to get time. I was planning to do this over the weekend. I didn't. If you go into our land use code today, I was looking at, it's no surprise that I am particularly focused on how can we expand housing options, and also recognizing that the current options are very expensive to build. Even an ADU costs somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000 on average to build, which is just outside of the capabilities of most people. So you look at other options. Tiny homes are an option that are significantly less expensive. Steve has pointed out the fact that the way we define manufactured homes really doesn't reflect the current market. You can get manufactured homes 3D printed on site for something more in the range of $40,000 to $50,000. You can get, I read this great article about the Sears Roebuck catalog and how after World War II, most of those beautiful craftsman homes selling for $800,000 in the Chicago suburbs were built out of catalog to order manufacturing kits. And so we're coming back to a world where manufactured home doesn't mean trailers putting on sites in uranium camps, you know? And so, okay, in our current land use code, to build a manufactured property development, first of all, it's a conditional use permit. It's not an actual permitted right in any underlying zone.
Right.
And it requires 4 acres of land, which means the only people who can feasibly do that are people who have the money to be broad scale developers. And we've already seen those folks tend to be incented towards higher impact uses.
Mhm.
So all that to be said is I would like to start the conversation and invite comments and ideas related to our land use code specific to manufactured home developments. Personally, I would like to see the code come down to more of a 1 acre or even to a ½ acre requirement, with the thing that sort of governs the use of that land dictated by the square footage required for each dwelling that is permitted on that lot. In the conversation about the temporary land use permit, just to come back to that really quick, the way that the steering committee was talking about permitting, rather than doing it by the unit, rather than saying, well, you have a permit for 5 units and you have a permit for 6 units, do it instead by the relative size of the underlying lot, the availability of infrastructure, and the relative size of each unit. So if you have a ½ acre, you have 2 toilets on site, you could have maybe 10 tiny homes permitted for your employee campground. Is there a way to extend that same math to a manufactured home development that was in a, you know, one of our middle tier residential zones, for example, that we're looking at in the updated land use code map? I would really like to see us look closely at this. This is as far as I need to take it tonight. I'm doing some research and I'll share as I go along, but would invite anybody who is equally excited about this idea, Steve, to spend some time looking into it. And maybe what I'll do is I'll create a Google Doc that we can all put some ideas in and then go from there. But just wanted to raise that for future considerations.
Definitely.
In general.
Sounds good. Yep. And as far as the future land use draft maps, we are still waiting to get those back from the consultant. We did get a first version of those, but they just didn't have a few things that I thought were pretty obviously missing. So I didn't want to bring them in a public meeting yet until we kind of fine tune them. But they've been really good and to work with in terms of giving them the feedback. And so hopefully I'm sure that it is the plan to have them on the next meeting for you guys to give some feedback on. So, and I'll present the maps with the land use descriptions as well, so it'll be kind of the whole package. You can see what that has all come to. The land use descriptions, I've also taken all of your comments so far and I've given them to the consultant to kind of figure out some modifications for those as well. So look forward to that.
Final future consideration, there was a suggestion that we revisit the requirements around justification for public hearings and for recommendation actions. To be honest, I'm actually not that it matters. We'll follow it anyway. I don't know that we are held to the same standards as county commission since we're not a legislative body, but I do think it's a great suggestion. We have started to add these to our packets. So as we have public hearing come in, we do have the information around providing justification to our motions, but I think it was a good suggestion. Rather than spend time in one of these meetings, I've asked our Director of Planning Zoning, Elisa, to please organize some time where we can have a just open training session, especially for newer members of the commission. It's a good reminder anyway. Talk about like Robert's rules. Why do we follow these silly agenda things?
Right.
I imagine it's something we can make open for the public to listen into if they wanted to, if they were curious. And then we also have these lovely books for planning commissioners. Let's see, hold it from the owl that you can come in and get.
You have to have
If
that
you
read by
are-
next meeting, Erin.
If you find yourself having difficulty getting to sleep on a Saturday, you could research manufactured home land use specifications or read
Yeah,
one of our
we have-
lovely books.
We have a whole bunch of them in the office, so just come by anytime.
Book club will be next to, no, just kidding. So that's it for future considerations. Any other comments, questions, future considerations? Is there a motion to adjourn? Motion
I just
by
want to give a
Rebecca. Oh,
Oh.
go ahead.
I wanted to give a heads up that I won't be at the next meeting.
Awesome. Thank you very much. If anyone else is not
But
going
I-
to be there either, send an email just so we make sure we have quorum, please. Sorry, Steve, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was gonna say, and I don't have anything further, so I move to adjourn, or make a motion to adjourn.
Rick already moved, but sounds like you're a second. So I'll